The Richard Roeper Show is brought to you by AmericanEagle.com Studios. The digital landscape is changing rapidly, and to compete in today's online business environment, you need that experienced partner. Since 1995, AmericanEagle.com has partnered with companies of all sizes, offering web design, web development, e-commerce, mobile apps, and digital marketing to drive your overall business's success because they believe that today's online world is your online opportunity. Visit AmericanEagle.com to get started today. That's AmericanEagle.com. All right, guys, we got lots to get to. Guys, we always say. When I say guys, I mean all of you. You know that. And that's a kind of a Chicago thing, probably even a Dalton thing, and that's my hometown. And it's also the hometown of Pope Leo the 14th. We've talked about this. Pope Leo, we called him Bob back in the day. Okay, I didn't call him Bob. I didn't know. He was a little older than me, but that's what his name is, Bob. But now he's Pope Leo the 14th. He's the Pope. And I don't know if you saw this earlier this week. Too great. There's a parade in the Vatican, and the Pope is on the, in the Pope mobile waving to the assembled worshipers, and it's wonderful and lots of love for the Pope. I love the Pope. He's so smart and so modern and so compassionate, but he's also from Dalton, my hometown, which is, essentially just a few miles south of Chicago. And he's well known as a White Sox fan. When the Pope was first elected, there was this speculation in the media: is he a Cubs fan or a Sox fan? Turns out he's a big White Sox fan. They now have a mural of him at Guaranteed Rate Field, White Sox Park, Whiskey Park, whatever you want to call it. And they even have a nice little plaque, the seat where the Pope sat for a game of 2005 World Series that the White Sox won. So somebody yells out, "Go Cubs!" And the Pope responds, "On perdido," which is "they have lost" in Spanish, and then says, "They lost," because the Cubs were recently defeated, right, by the Brewers in the playoffs. And it's just so great because, first of all, no matter where you go, imagine now the wife or friend or whoever of this Cubs fan, they go to the Vatican, right, which is literally the holy, the center, the Holy See, for those of us who are Catholic. And they're literally within shouting distance of the Pope. And this goofball yells out, "Go Cubs." Not, "Hey, fellow Chicagoan," or, "Pope Leo, Chicago loves you." He's got it. And the Pope can't resist. You can take the Pope out of Dalton, but you can't take the Dalton out of the Pope. He's got to get, "Yeah, they lost. You guys lost." It's just so funny. I don't know if there are other cases of popes returning heckles to anybody. I mean, it's all good natured, of course, but it just goes to show you whether you're on the concourse at Wrigley Field after a game, Cubs and Sox fans. And there's always a couple of fights, but listen, there's always also fights when it's just all fans of the same team. But it's mostly good natured. I've been to dozens of these Cubs Sox games on both sides of town. But you're going down the concourse after the game. Whoever won that team, their fans are cheering, and the other ones are saying you suck. And it's that kind of back and forth. And there's always like, "Well, we won the World Series in 2005. Yeah, we won in 2016. But it doesn't matter if you're on the concourses at Wrigley Field or the Vatican. There's going to be some Cubs Sox fan trolling. Kind of great. This is interesting. The Emmys have responded to Seth Rogen's claim he's been banned from presenting. Did you hear about this? I think Seth, I'm not going to do my Seth Rogen. I often tell you guys in advance, I'm not going to give you my bad impersonation of various celebrities, but sorry. So Seth Rogen was on Jimmy Kimmel Live, and he talked about how he's been not banned from the Emmys. In fact, he just won like 4 Emmys, right, for the studio. Fantastic work by Seth Rogen. All like 4 Emmys. It's pretty cool. But he says he's not allowed to present anymore because at the 2021 Emmys, now remember this was during the thick of COVID, and he was told it was going to be outdoor. Remember they did the outdoor ceremonies for a few awards, and the almost small crowd and spacing and all that, social distancing, and then you'd have Zoom acceptance speeches and all that crazy stuff. So Seth Rogen says that for the 2021 ceremony, they said it was going to be outdoors, but it was actually in a hermetically sealed tent, and he was appalled. So when he went up there, he said, "Let me start by saying there's way too many of us in this little room. What are we doing? They said it was going to be outdoors. It's not. They lied to us." And he says, apparently it's more, this is what he said in 2021. "It's more important that we have 3 chandeliers than we make sure we don't kill Eugene Levy." It was funny. Yeah, and he was right. But the producers were pissed. So they said they would not like him to present anymore. I guess they've actually, they've actually responded and said, yeah, we look forward to seeing Seth Rogen in the audience at the Emmys. This is what the Television Academy says. So they gave an exclusive statement to Entertainment Weekly. The Television Academy congratulates Mr. Rogen on his multiple Emmy wins this past September. We look forward to seeing him in the audience at many ceremonies to come. All right, listen, get off your high horse, Television Academy. First of all, Seth Rogen had every right to call you out years ago, 4 years ago now, almost 5 years ago, right? If it was a tent and they said it wasn't going to be a tent, and also, he's just poking humor at the situation, which was a very dire situation, and he was appalled that it was a hermetically sealed tent. So roll with it, man. The guy won 4 Emmys. He should be presenting next year. Get over yourself, Emmys. Television Academy. Okay, this is a fascinating story in the Los Angeles Times by Stacey Perman, the reporter. Hollywood's newest drama, Fake Props. It's interesting over the years that collecting has become such a big thing, and there have been collectors forever. I remember Pawn Stars. I don't know is Pawn Stars still on, but I like everybody else. I watched it for a long time. I don't watch it much anymore. But it was always fascinating when someone would bring in a blunderbuss gun or something, or some relic, and then they'd say, "Wait a minute, now is this real?" And sometimes it was, and sometimes it really was. Groucho Marx's tuxedo from the Night at the Opera or something, whatever the case may be. But I think in I want to say the last 25, 30 years, collecting has become so huge of everything. The card industry, not just trading cards of obviously baseball cards, but also basketball and football and all the sports, soccer and entertainers. And they do all kinds of crazy trading cards and huge conventions and Hot Wheels and Legos and old toys, whatever the case may be. And of course, when we were growing up, everybody has the famous story. My mom threw out my baseball card collection. It's always mom. Dad never threw out the baseball card collection. He wanted to, check out the baseball cards. And, if I only had not used my Star Wars box in the 70s, but of course, that's what makes a collectible a collectible. You don't know it's going to be worth something. So not everybody saved that Michael Jordan rookie card from back in the day, which is now worth, I'm sure 7 figures. And nowadays, it's again, the last 20, 30 years, it's a lot more difficult for modern collectibles. For example, somebody gave me a set of baseball cards as a birthday gift one time I want to think it was from like 1989. And it's intact and it's great. And I think it's worth about $60 out there because so many people started saving things intact. And, even with toys, they'll buy 2 toys and keep one in the original packaging. I've even seen that like the very first iPhones, if you've got one, people will pay, especially if it's in the box and it's unsealed, they'll pay a ton for that because again, we all used our iPhones, right? And same thing with Hollywood. There's so many great props from back in the day, and then a lot of times there was famous stories about how stuff would just get thrown out or thrown in storage warehouses where things would deteriorate, literally mothballs and things like that. And I think it's sometime I want to say in the 70s there were some studios that would find stuff, and they did some auctions and realized there was a real market for this. So now you hear all these stories now about these famous prop items that go for millions of dollars. That's one of the original sleds from Rosebud, the sled from Citizen Kane and things like that. But the story here is interesting from the LA Times from Stacey Perman. Star Wars fans thought they'd been shot into hyperspace. Memorabilia auction houses announced earlier this year that an original and fully intact Han Solo blaster, the very one wielded by the smuggler played by Harrison Ford in Episode 4, A New Hope, would be going on the block. So they think there were 3 guns made for the 1977 film, and 2 of them were disassembled and returned to the weapons rental shop in London. Someone said, "Oh, maybe we'll reuse this is again, back in '77. This weird space cowboy movie. We can maybe reuse these prop guns for a Star Trek or something. I don't know." So there's been all these stories, this mythology about the third blaster out there. So the auction houses were saying it had provenance. That's the things that prove that it is what it is, and was going to fetch as much as $3 million. But then the big time fervid collectors slavishly examined photos of this prop gun, tracing the serial number, seeing that it had this sort of online history, and then there were some doubts about whether or not it was legitimate, and it was pulled off the market. So as the article goes on to say, in cinema's early days, the props were often seen as the byproduct of filmmaking without any intrinsic value. For example, the painted backdrop of the Emerald City used in The Wizard of Oz was found decades later by a salvage crew that had been hired just to remove trash that was stored on the studio backlot. Humphrey Bogart's trench coat from Casablanca and other items like that. They said often it would be makeup artists or production people, electricians taking them home as souvenirs because it was just like, oh, this is a souvenir. But as I mentioned in July, one of the Rosebud sleds, oh my God, the Rosebud sled sold for $14.75 million. And Sotheby's, and I know that's one of the big ones at Heritage. I think this was Heritage Auctions. Dorothy's ruby slippers, $30 million. Well, as soon as you get these huge prices fetched for stuff, you also get fake. So, like as I mentioned with that Harrison Ford Han Solo gun, it turned out that like they really couldn't prove it was used in the movie. And now you've got 3D printers and digital, technology and everything, and they can do aging on things. So be very careful if you're out there. If you've got an extra 15 mil or so to spend on a sled for Citizen Kane or 30 million for Dorothy's ruby slippers, you really got to double, triple check. I have a couple of props, but none of them are super expensive, and I know they're legitimate because they were given to me by people who worked on the respective shows. I was a big fan of Sons of Anarchy, and I got a couple of shot glasses from the bar where the guys all hung out. And I have actually, I don't know why they all had to be liquor, but now that I think about it, they're all liquor related. Most of these little props I have. I got somebody who worked on Mad Men got me a Don Draper highball glass. That was actually used. Because they did a little bit of drinking and smoking on that Mad Men, but nothing more extravagant than that. And that brings us to another prop related story. How about that for your segue? Michael J. Fox in his new memoir talked about the making of Back to the Future, right? And he says, yes, he knows about there's certain, hardcore fans of the movie, but also people that look into all the paradoxes and things like that with time travel. I guess a well-known bit of Back to the Future lore that the Gibson ES 345 guitar, it's a Gibson ES 345, beautiful guitar, right? That remember Marty McFly, it's Marvin Berry, cousin of Chuck in the band, and he plays Johnny B. Good, and that supposedly is how, and then Marvin calls Chuck. Kind of a little cultural appropriation weirdness, but whatever. It's 1985 movie, okay? But the guitar that Marty McFly plays Johnny B. Good on was not introduced until 1958, which is 3 years after the 1955 scene in the movie. And people have talked a lot about that, and they're saying, "Oh my God, that's a real flaw." And interesting too that when they started to make Back to the Future 2, they couldn't find the guitar, and they still haven't found it. So they're still trying to find the guitar that was used in the original movie. Somebody's got it somewhere, or maybe not. Maybe it got thrown out. But yeah, so in the timeline of Back to the Future, Michael J. Fox's Marty McFly is playing a guitar that wasn't introduced until 1958. And it kills me. It cracks me up that this is the problem when people are studying the logic of Back to the Future. Now, of course, there are all kinds of other rips in the time, space, fabric, and all that stuff. And one of the most famous ones, of course, is okay. So Marty McFly goes back in time, right? And he's a teenager who becomes known as Calvin Klein, right? They call him Calvin Klein because of his underwear or whatever. And Calvin Klein, their friend back then, plays a crucial role in getting his parents together, George and Lorraine, right? He gets them together. But then if we go back to 1985, the altered version where their parents are more successful and all that kind of stuff, they don't know that their son looks exactly like Calvin Klein, who got them together in high school. Why wouldn't they recognize him? And there's a bunch of other stuff. But I would also like to point out that it's a time travel movie, and I love Back to the Future. The second and third, are not as much fun, but they're okay. But the first one is just such great 1980s time travel entertainment. But when you are doing a movie, when you are experiencing a movie about time travel, none of them make sense. They can't, because you know what? There's no such thing as time travel. So there's always going to be, there are always rules. They always say, you can't try, if you go back in time, one of the rules of time travel fiction, whether it's literature or film or TV series, one of the rules is you can't try to alter history. You got to just do, you go back in time and you can try to talk to your younger self, which is always interesting because your younger self is like, who's this idiot? Well, I'm you and you're me. Don't do that. But if you try to do something big, like prevent the sinking of the Titanic or, prevent the assassination of Lincoln or, don't go to the theater. I don't tell me not to go to the theater. That's my Abe Lincoln. If you do that, like there'll be this huge ripple and everything, the world will explode or something. Or no matter what you try to do to alter events, they're still going to play out in a certain way. You can't try to put an end to World War II because there'll be a bigger World War III or something. They have all these rules. You're not supposed to talk to your younger self. You can, you can observe it or whatever. But, they're just rules that are made up because it's a time travel movie. And with all time travel movies, at some point, don't know why I'm smacking my chair. You just go with it. So I don't, to me, it's like the guitar, especially, I don't give a shit. But it's fun. It's fun and it's cool that people care. Let's take a break. We're going to talk about Portillo's and then, we got Black Phone 2, the sequel to Black Phone. I still think they should have called it White Phone because remember there was a White Phone in the first movie, or Black Phone, Phone Home, but it's Black Phone 2. And we're going to review that and talk about some other stuff right after the break. All right, we're going to talk about Portillo's. You guys know the drill here. They're known for their famous Chicago hot dogs with all the famous correct Chicago ingredients, right down to that poppy seed bun. But there's so much more. They got great burgers. You can get Italian sausage, Italian beef, amazing French fries, also some really good salads. Don't shortchange the salads at Portillo's. And then, of course, you top it off with the legendary, the one and only chocolate cake. I know people who order the entire cake for birthdays and other occasions, but you can also get a slice, which will probably last you 2 helpings because it's amazing. And always, of course, you keep the cake at room temperature. That's how they do it at Portillo's. That's how you want to consume it. Now, there are Portillo's in many locations across the country, but you can also order online and ship it via portillos.com. You can find a location near you, order online. Portillo's, Portillos.com, Portillos.com.
Have you heard of the grabber? I killed him.
What happened in that basement really changed it. Finn, I had a bad dream. It was about missing kids.
It was just a dream.
About a real place. A youth camp. We have to go there.
Hello, Finny. What do you think happens when you die in a dream? It's time to find out.
Okay. It was 3 years ago that we had the kind of surprise 2022 hit, The Black Phone, which I really like because it was kind of filmed in the style of the era that it's set in, 30, 40 years ago. And you had Ethan Hawke as the grabber, this horrific creature, this monster who drove around in the black van and then would kidnap kids and horrific, fictional, by the way. We got a lot of true crime, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Fictionalized version of true crime. But The Black Phone, I thought, was really, really well done, tightly constructed. Now you got Black Phone 2, and it's going back to the supernatural trauma of Finney and his sister. And Finney is played by Mason Thames and Sister Gwen, Madeline McGraw. And they're both really good in this. So this is years after, some time after, a little while after the events of the first film where they, where Finney eventually was able to take down the grabber. The grabber's dead, but now they're in Colorado and the phone starts ringing, and somehow the grabber is not dead. How can the grabber not be dead? And there's all kinds of dreams and visions, and they kind of amp up the supernatural element, and it's really creepy and really scary. And again, they play with film stocks and things to make it kind of reflect the time. Really well done. The Black Phone franchise, there's definitely, and listen, it's like a lot of these. You can always have the villain come back one way or another. But I'd be in for a Black Phone 3. I like Black Phone 2. It's a solid 3-star effort. A much more, and even though this Black Phone 2 is, it's intense and violent, but a much more serious take on monsters, a real life monster, is Devil in Disguise, the Peacock limited series. They had a documentary. There was a documentary about 4 years ago, but this is now the fictionalization of it. So Michael Chernis plays John Wayne Gacy, the notorious serial killer. So this is set in Des Plaines, Illinois. Again, it's a suburb of Chicago, and it goes into a deep dive. Again, a fictionalization, but I would say a very essentially true depiction of events about John Wayne Gacy and the 33, at least, maybe more victims of his evilness, his murderous ways. And very good cast. Not a lot of well-known actors, and I think that actually kind of helps the veracity of the show, even though it wasn't filmed in the Chicago area. And I'm always a big champion for things that are set here in my home area and anywhere to be set and be filmed in the actual location. I think they shot this up in Canada, but they do a good job of capturing the kind of late 70s. It's December. It's very bleak, overcast, rain and snow in Chicago. So this would have been like, 1978, right around there. And what I really admire about this series is that it spends at least as much time telling the stories of various victims and their family members. And it hops back and forth along the timeline. We go back 5 or 6 years, and then in present day. And all this is, I was in high school at the time, just getting out, but I ended up meeting some of the main players, the prosecutor Bill Kunkel, Sam Amarante, who was the attorney for Gacy, and he was a young attorney, and it was a high profile case, and of course there was a lot of hate directed toward him, but everyone, even monsters, deserve a fair trial in this, a fair hearing and a defense in this country. But we get to see their stories as well. And, once again, and I'm pretty familiar over the years with the John Wayne Gacy case. As a news columnist, I interviewed the parents of some of the victims years later when he was making his way to all of his appeals and eventually execution on death row. I went to the evidence room and was able to examine a lot of the evidence from the case, very sobering and serious stuff. But one of the outrageous things about this, one of the most infuriating things, is a lot of the young men, the teenagers and young men who disappeared were runaways. Some of them were thought to be perhaps, in the gay scene. And again, this is in the 1970s. So the Chicago police, when a series of, they'd hear about missing boys and they'd say, nobody's even looking for these kids. They didn't take it seriously. And there was even an instance where someone had been beaten severely by Gacy and went to the police, and they said, this looks like a quarrel between lovers. It's the same kind of thing that happened with Jeffrey Dahmer, where they're, because the victims weren't considered to be coming from good homes or to be living, the straight life, that the police didn't take it as seriously, which is obscene and horrific. And it really was. It took like a suburban kid with parents who went to the local police to kind of get everybody, focusing on the case. So the series spends as much time telling the stories of the victims. It's a procedural. It does not glorify John Wayne Gacy for 1 second. We see some moments of some horrific, torture and violence, but it doesn't revel in it, unlike Monster, the Ed Gein story, which was just on Netflix a couple of weeks ago, which absolutely wallows in the cult of personality about these serial killers. And we get these lavish, heavily, stylized productions. And Charlie Hunnam, who's a great actor, but, he does this very kind of over the top performance. And there's even like a musical number in there. And there's all these fictional, huge leaps of fiction that have nothing to do with anything, that try to tie Gein to other serial killers, and we get the Richard Speck nonsense. I shouldn't say nonsense because it was also horrific, but that character's brought in. So again, with the John Wayne Gacy series, what I really appreciate is that they tell the story. And listen, we're all into the true crime, or a lot of us are, and there have been documentaries. And Brian Dennehy played John Wayne Gacy years ago in a movie, and was very good at it. But this is a series that reminds us of what it's all about. It's about the victims and their stories, and the cops. And again, I remember that story, seeing on the local news, and of course, then it became national news because cops are following Gacy around for about 2 weeks. They knew this guy would, and he had a previous conviction that had been ignored or somehow overlooked by police. But they just kept tailing him, and Gacy was this arrogant, weird, creepy, kind of a glad-hander, and worked in politics, and kind of a wannabe cop, had badges and all this shit. And he kind of welcomed the cops, and then they finally just got him. They nailed him, and he confessed to his attorney, and they still had no idea. They thought maybe 2 or 3 victims, and then they eventually started going into the house. In fact, the 2 cops who realized there was something happening in the crawl space, it was because he had invited them into his house. He said, "Yeah, you're out in the cold. You're telling me come in." And there was this wretched smell, this horrible smell coming through the vents, and then body after body. And I remember seeing the footage of authorities, the state police, local police, carrying these bodies. And it took a long time. And then because it was cold, and then frigid conditions, and then there was this huge blizzard, it took a long time, to discover. And then some bodies had been dumped in the river. So it was an ongoing horror story, real life, here in Chicago. And I think they do a really solid and respectful job in the Peacock Limited series. All right, that's going to do it for this week's podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and we will talk again soon.